Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Porter. It's no surprise that there are daunting moral and cultural ills that plague American democracy in our republic today, as well as the civic resources that unfortunately continue to wane despite the fact that we have access to them. Joining me to have a conversation about all this and the very nature of the Founding Foundation is Daniel Mahoney, Senior Research Fellow at the Simon Center at the Heritage Foundation. He's also Senior Teaching Fellow in the Graduate Program at Hillsdale College, Washington, D.C., and Contributing Editor at the Claremont Review of Books. Daniel, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Oh, my great pleasure, Marcus.
So I want to begin by talking about the reality of the founding of our nation as a broad stroke conversation, but from there, why we ought to be grateful for so unique a political experiment in heritage.
You know, I think gratitude ought to be a fundamental response of the human person, and we live in an age of negation and repudiation. You know, everyone's a victim. Everyone finds myriad reasons to complain. We see, you know, there's a kind of obligatory public philosophy in some elite circles, many of our educational institutions, that emphasize the multiple reasons why we ought to reject or repudiate our founding or our principles. The mainline Presbyterian Church issued a statement this year, a month or so ago, saying they would not be commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the American founding because this country is a fundamentally unjust and exploitative country. You know, all human institutions are imperfect, but compared to what? I mean, America has had a remarkable and remarkably successful experiment in Republican self-government. As I say in my recent piece that you were alluding to, American Renewal and the Politics of Gratitude at Law and Liberty, yes, in recent years we've seen the specter of moral nihilism, many features of a cultural debacle, cultural decline, but I think it's hard to blame those on the principles that animate this nation. I know there are post-liberals and integralists and others who claim that, but in most cases, the decline or the decay is tied to a repudiation of those principles. And I'm not one of those people who thinks America was ill-founded. I don't think the American founding exhausts everything, but as I like to say, the Founding Fathers presupposed a lot of what they didn't have to theorize. They presupposed a healthy family, a sane social order, a fundamentally religious people, etc. And they certainly did nothing to actively undermine any of that. So, you know, look, we've had this nation, this constitutional republic has had remarkable longevity, 250 years. We're a great paradox as a people and nation. We're a young nation, but we're a very old polity. You know, the French have had 20 different regimes in 1789, and they're a much older nation than we are. So, no, I think there are multiple reasons for gratitude, but there are many reasons for alarm. And the alarm is our departure from the wellsprings of Western civilization and the best of the American nation, the American founding.
I'm really glad to hear you share all of that, and I share those very similar concerns. The reality is, I don't believe that this nation was ill-founded. I believe that our founders took the best of every single political and historical heritage that they had access to, and they created for us a republic that presupposed belief in God and therefore moral accountability to the divine, virtuous polity, or at least a naturally virtuous polity. And they also presupposed an intellectual sanity and, frankly, intellectual formation of a populace that would fight to preserve that which they'd been given. Unfortunately, we've seen those very structures erode. Just share with us how we got here and how far we've deviated from this intent of what the populace ought to look like in the mind of the founders.
Well, you know, I think If you look at the founding of the United States, especially our constitutional founding, 1787, our framers were not utopian. Men are not angels, and they established constitutional institutions that limited power, checking power, because they were cognizant of human imperfection. On the other hand, James Madison, the same man who wrote Federalists number 10 and 51 that lay out all those constitutional mechanisms, including checks and balances and separation of powers, he also said that Republican government presupposes virtue more than any other. I think meaning that if we're going to have a free people, you can't police people all the time. Most policing comes in the form of conscience and self-restraint. And the founders thought they believed in something like natural law or natural moral sentiments, and they certainly didn't believe that the distinctions between truth and falsehood and right and wrong were arbitrary or conventional. And I agree with you. I think it's a mistake to say, oh, it's just an Enlightenment project. Robert Cranach, who recently retired from Colgate, a Catholic political theorist, a gifted one, he wrote a wonderful article in 2020 on America as a blended Scotch. And he said, you can't, if you just reduce it all to the Enlightenment or Locke, you miss out. You miss out on the strong influence of Protestant Christianity. You miss out on the common law. You miss out on their respect for classical wisdom. They read the classics. I mean, I think if there's any classical figure who was almost universally esteemed by the founders, it was Cicero. And it was, Cicero, his high-minded defense of a commonwealth, of a republic, his sense of duty, a very non-utilitarian sense of morality, but also a sense of rights and law along with duty. That's an important element in the American founding. So to say we're just modern and we're moving away from Christianity toward pure secularism, I think misses the boat. At the same time, John Courtney Murray quoted the American Catholic bishops of Baltimore in 1881, who said that the American founders built better than they knew. And I think what they meant was, well, perhaps the American framers, their political philosophy, to the extent they had a political philosophy, it may not be perfect in every respect. Perhaps the mix of, modern natural rights and natural law, Enlightenment and Christianity and classicism, perhaps it isn't perfect. But what they established, liberty under law, a regime of ordered liberty, of constitutional liberty, a deep respect and reliance on a providential God. People forget, the Declaration, it talks about nature and nature's God, but it also speaks in a very theistic way about providence and a providential God, a supreme judge of the universe. That's hardly deism. And you add to that, yes, there are inalienable rights, but there's also an appeal to the sacred honor of the American people. So I think if you look at their moral universe, it's a pretty healthy one. And again, they presupposed that Americans would continue to respect and abide by these extra constitutional principles and practice that gave, sustenance to our freedom. And I think largely where we went wrong, we cut that off. We began interpreting liberty and equality in light of radical secularism. And there's nothing more corrosive of authentic American principles and of sound human life than this ethos of pure human autonomy, self-assertion, freeing a godless liberty. That is hardly the American way.
I'm talking with Daniel Mahoney, Senior Research Fellow at the Simon Center at the Heritage Foundation, Senior Teaching Fellow in the Graduate Program at Hillsdale College, and we're talking about essentially a renewal of the American founding, but also gratitude for the great political experiment we've been given. We're going to continue on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Pete. I'm talking with Daniel Mahoney, Senior Research Fellow in the Simon Center at the Heritage Foundation. We are talking about renewal and gratitude with regard to the American founding. Daniel, you highlighted many crucial things about the founding of our nation. And so when we take a look at the nation as it is today and the continued unfortunate social and political fragmentation we're seeing, and you also highlight in your piece on Law and Liberty that even amongst those who identify as political conservatives, social conservatives, we're seeing a kind of culture of repudiation, rightly called, this antagonistic view of even the founding and many of the beliefs that we hold as true in American society. I invite you to speak to this broadly and to help us understand what's going on now.
Well, I do think the term culture repudiation came from the late, great Roger Scruton, the English conservative political philosopher. And Scruton always emphasized the importance of gratitude in human and political life and spiritual life. He emphasized the deep sense of indebtedness we ought to have to our cultural, political, spiritual, and civilizational inheritance. And as he said, for a long time on the left, the academic left, the activist left, the philosophical and theological left, the emphasis has been on repudiation, getting rid of the old wisdom, no more pietas, no more deference to the wisdom of the past. And I think the spirit of repudiation is the dominant spirit on the left. It's certainly not the dominant spirit on the right. But there are some disturbing currents on the new right. Not everyone. Sometimes I call it the internet right. But these know-nothings who say, America was ill-founded, just throw the founding out, or they say, the founding was a poison pill that led to contemporary cultural debasement and moral nihilism. And they also have an attitude really rooted, I think, often in ignorance of that all the great figures of the past, let's say in the conservative movement and the American regime, they were all frauds. They were, William F. Buckley was just a rhino, which is nonsense. Or, they debate whether we should prefer Hitler to Winston Churchill, this kind of thing. And that spirit of repudiation is un-American, un-Christian, and unconservative. So I wrote my piece in part to say, yes, we need a politics of gratitude. Yes, our country needs renewal. But no, there is no renewal if we approach things in a spirit of negation and repudiation. The wise man knows all the debts he has to what has been passed on to him. And I get annoyed at adults who take their bearings from youngsters who don't know anything. I've been in higher education long enough that 19-year-olds know nothing. They may be spirited and energetic in some cases, but they are. Remember in the church we used to speak about invincible ignorance? Well, there's a lot of invincible ignorance among the young. So our job is to teach them. Listen to them, not get too set in our ways, but do not think to accommodate the new generation. We have to. That's what the left did in the 60s and 70s. It's just, the radicals, the kids, they were going to renew the country. They were right. They wanted to tear everything down. And also I'm disturbed by what I would call a neo-paganism, neo-Nietzscheanism on part of the right. It's not the dominant current, but it's a current, that somehow, and by the way, kind of soft Christians who confuse Christianity with secular humanitarianism, who confuse caritas with compassion, who believe, we ought to have open borders and that we can't defend ourselves and all that. They feed into the notion that Christianity is incompatible with civilizational self-preservation. And I think the official church needs to think more about, do we really want the full Islamicization of Europe, for example? There are more virtues and values under heaven than open borders, for God's sake, So I really do believe that we have a perfect storm where a certain loss of Christian fortitude has reinforced this neo-pagan impression that Christianity is a soft religion that cannot defend civilization and virtue. But true Christianity is not it's not a religion of resentment or weakness, as Nietzsche said. And I think if the West gets rid of its Christian mark, if it and turns to some spurious paganism, as some of the new right want, it would be a disaster. We've seen that before. We've seen the vitalism. We've seen the social Darwinism. We've seen the paganism. It doesn't, of course, I'm not talking about the noble paganism of the ancients. I'm talking about the newfangled paganism of the racial right and that kind of thing. So Christianity's got to be part of any solution, but it's got to be a Christianity that Maritain, I have mixed minds about Maritain, but he certainly was an admirable man in many respects. But at the end of his life, he was very disillusioned with the spirit of Vatican II, the false appropriation of the council. And he said, I called for a dialogue with the modern world, not kneeling before the world, not a capitulation to the zeitgeist. So that's what we Christians need. We need self-confidence. We need our own gratitude. Why so many people think the church will renew itself by, being hesitant about or even rejecting its own wisdom is completely beyond me.
As glad as I am to hear you say that, I share the same befuddlement, and it is difficult to understand why this modern sense of now, you've categorized a few things, like cosplaying paganism, juvenile Nietzscheanism. In all of this, we've got a new generation, in fact, a few new generations, that have complete historical amnesia that has resulted in historical antagonism. And so all they're doing is pointing the finger at the founding and the founding fathers and the historical heritage we've received with nothing but a critical lens and a worldview, which not only is this horribly ungrateful, it's horrendously juvenile.
A French friend of mine, a great sociologist, has said, what we need today is a critique of critique. That this negative, everything is critical, everything's deconstructive, everything's transgressive. And we really need to show that attitude, that merely critical attitude, is destructive of political wisdom, of spiritual integrity, of any possibility for the renewal of our civilization. And you mentioned, yes, this ignorance we've been talking about. None of this nonsense could occur without massive ignorance. But look at this resurgence of not just radical socialism, but of communism. We have young people, 35, 40% of people who say they have a positive view of communism. I mean, do they know anything about the theory and practice of communism, its record, its criminal activities, its negation of human dignity? Have they read authors like Solzhenitsyn and Havel and Shewa Miłosz or John Paul II? No. And we did nothing to teach them. The Cold War comes to an end, or more or less to an end, and we just decided that we would move along and not draw any deeper abiding lessons from it. And we're living with the consequences, I believe. I don't mean to depress you or your listeners, because, we got to face these unpalatable facts in order to reverse them or to work against them. We have to, we've blown it, but it's never too late. T.S. Eliot once said there are no lost causes because there's never any gained causes. It's always this Sisyphean battle, the battle, but the drama of good and evil and the human soul. We never win definitively, but short of the consummation of things. But we don't lose definitively either. There's always hope. There's always hope, and we have free will. The political philosopher Eric Voegelin said it quite beautifully. No one is obliged to be complicit in the moral and intellectual pathologies of the age. and
Go ahead,
we
please.
don't have to be complicit. We can speak the truth. We can act prudently, intelligently, forcefully. We can do our best. And, there's no guarantee of victory, but there's also no guarantee of defeat. So that's my version of not optimism, but hope.
Well, and I share it with you, and I don't feel depressed at all. In fact, all of what you're sharing, clarion calls that I have sounded on this program multiple times, that there is much that we can reclaim, fight for, and renew within our republic. But it's going to involve all of us waking up and realizing that we are behaving in a rather immature manner, and that this integralism that we're seeing rising in numerous circles, over and above that, this just sense of a culture of repudiation. All of this is going to do us no good. These are idealistic.
Well, the nihilists and the adherents of the culture of repudiation hate our republic, hate our founding. And why do these people on the deranged new right think that we're going to stand up to the nihilists by contributing to their efforts of repudiation? It's an utterly self-destructive path they propose. And by the way, we have to be realistic. There's never, the idea of a golden age in the past where everything was fine before the modern decline. Every era has its deep problems, and even the Christian centuries, as admirable as the living faith was, there were political abuses.
Yeah. Daniel, I'm so sorry. We're going to have to end there. My guest has been Daniel Mahoney, Senior Research Fellow at the Simon Center. Let's be grateful for our nation.